Good evening. Hello again. Welcome to another episode of the Katerji Show with me, your host, Katerji. We've got an interesting show tonight. We're going to delve into the world of planning, trying to build in Britain. And the big question that we want to answer is this Britain's most expensive shed? And without further ado, I've got CityAM's city editor, Simon Hunt, on tonight to give us the ins and outs, particularly his latest article. So welcome, Simon.
Good evening. Thanks very much for having me.
My pleasure. So the question I have is you've recently written an article about a shed, but I want you to give me the ins and outs of it, relay it, and I'll leave a link in the show notes, obviously. But it just kind of shows what we're dealing with in Britain at the moment. So talk to me about the shed, Simon.
Yeah, I think it's, as you say, I think it's a very useful metaphor. So yeah, as you introduced me, I work at CityAM. So we're a business newspaper based in the City of London. And I suppose in some respects we like to refer to ourselves as a local paper that just happens to be in the middle of Europe's financial centre. And so obviously a lot of what we cover will be financial markets rather than actual local news. Having said that, we do, and partly because we're the only ones that really do it, we do look at what the City of London Corporation are doing. That's the local authority responsible for everything that takes place within the square mile. And part of that responsibility involves planning. And so I often at CityAM will once every week or two spend an hour or two just having a scroll through the City of London Corporation's planning portal. And I won't kid you, a lot of the time it's quite dull and I don't find anything particularly interesting in there. Sometimes that's not the case and there'll be a massive 40-story skyscraper that's just come through and we can look through all of the designs and it's quite exciting. But a lot of the time it's quite dull. But last week I came across something I thought was kind of curious. There was this planning application for what was called a security kiosk to be built underneath the Guildhall. The Guildhall being the sort of large public town hall that is often used for a lot of the functions of the corporation. And I thought, okay, the high level summary was there's an existing sort of shed kiosk thing. It's got a bit dilapidated. They're going to take it down and put a new one in. So surely that should be a fairly straightforward planning application. You know, given that most of the stuff the corporation deals with is like 40-story skyscrapers, like surely this little shed can't be much of an issue. But as I got into all the planning documents, I realized even building this little 2 meter by 2 meter structure was a huge planning nightmare, really, in lots of respects. So just I went through every single document that was on there. There were 26 separate planning documents that were submitted to this kiosk's sheds planning portal, comprising 86 pages and more than 15,000 words. You'll be pleased to know I didn't count them one by one. I got a machine to do that for me, but it's a huge body of work involved in it. And I get the impression that planning applications of this kind usually take a couple of months to put together. And this was submitted back in April. And it wasn't until last week, in other words, 4 months later, that the permission was granted. And this is the City of London planning officers basically granting themselves their own planning application. It took them 4 months to do that for this tiny building inside a car park. And I was just astounded by it and by all of the rigmarole that was involved in this. And I got in touch with the architects who submitted all these documents, and they told me that all of the planning that got involved in this, well, they didn't want me to quote the exact figure, but it was into the 5 figures just to do this, and that's before they even put a single brick down. I remember after David Cameron ceased to be Prime Minister, there was all this hoo-ha about this really expensive luxury shed he'd built in his back garden, and that apparently cost 25 grand, and we're looking at something close to that just for the application in this case. So I mean, that which made me wonder: is this the most expensive shed ever built in Britain? Well, it still hasn't been built, so I can't yet say. And the corporation wouldn't let me FOI them and how much it was costing them, so they're obviously a bit concerned this will get out as well. But I did find it fascinating, and of course, I mean, one of the things that is particular to this case is that the Guildhall, being this quite majestic building, it's a heritage building, it's a grade one listed building, and that means there are extra laws that it has to comply with. That includes having to produce what's called a heritage statement, where they talk about the heritage of the building and how this shed will fit in within that heritage, and also the car park's heritage, bizarrely, which, as it turned out, wasn't particularly extensive. And on top of that, the government's sort of body that oversees applications relating to heritage buildings, called Historic England, also had to make a statement on this application, and they said that they don't have anything to say, thankfully. But even that took a two-page letter just to do that, and it took them several weeks to do that as well. So from top to bottom, I just thought this is a metaphor for all of the problems we have with our planning system.
So, talk to me about those problems and why it takes 4 months to get the planning. I mean, obviously, the Guildhall, there are other regulations that don't necessarily, they're not the same as just trying to build a shed in your garden. But as you say, it's symptomatic of this kind of bureaucracy that we have, which is stifling growth, it's stifling building. We have a housing crisis in the country, and we have, this bureaucratic process that some of it very important stuff about health and safety, and some of it, about protecting rare species of spider and stuff that I think is absurd and goes through the court systems and clogs everything up. Maybe I'm stealing your thunder here from the kinds of things that we're dealing with, but talk to me about the problem with building in Britain and how regulations. We'll get on to NIMBYs after, but
Yeah.
talk to me about the regulations that are basically the way everything has to go, and how that maybe could be looking for some reform to try and actually back the builders as the government says it wants to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is obviously an issue that's particularly acute in London because of how expensive property has become because of a shortage of supply. I mean, I feel like I'm a born and bred Londoner, but I feel I'm starting to reach the age now where people I grew up with are telling me they're moving out of London because, if they want a place with more than one bedroom, that means either basically the very outskirts of London or beyond. So that I'm getting quite accustomed to that, and that's quite upsetting, I suppose, in many ways. But I mean, if you talk to economists, they will say there are lots of structural problems with the UK's economy, and there is no silver bullet to fix all of them. But the closest one we have is probably the fixing housing, because there are so many other second order problems that come as a result of it. But I'd say for housing or construction in the UK, but for London in particular, there are probably four key areas that are problems, and I can go into more detail for each of them. But the first one is, as you mentioned, the planning regulations. We have a huge body of law governing how things are built in this country, which has sort of been built up over several decades. And that creates a lot of complexity in the system that isn't necessary. The second is the way the planning system works and the way local authorities handle planning cases, the planning officers, how they work, and the incentives that they have, of which the shed is an obvious case because it took them 4 months to approve their own application. The third is the costs of construction. And by that, I don't necessarily just mean the cost of having to comply with all these regulations, but also, even if we had a perfect planning system, there are a lot of other costs that are acute in the UK right now. And that includes the material costs, which have gone up a lot, skills shortages in construction, and high energy costs, and also a lot of construction firms that, for all of those reasons, have gone bust in the past couple of years. And then I think the fourth one, particularly for London, is that even though geographically London's actually quite a big space, We allocate that space incredibly inefficiently. I mean, you could quite easily add another million homes to London without having to make it geographically any bigger. It's just we aren't using the space very well. So those are, I'd say, those are the four issues.
So look, let's dive in. Let bullet point them. Let we've got the beauty of this show is it's just kind of long form, and we can really get into the weeds. This might be boring to a lot of people, but we've got over 600 live listeners at the moment, so people are very kind of interested in the, I suppose, in the weeds of this. I don't know much about this, and I've always, one of the things that always fascinated me is I really wanted to like buy a little plot of land and build a little house on it, because my dad, basically a builder, my whole life I've watched him build things, and I know I am not like talented in that department, but I've seen it done so many times that I reckon I could give it a good crack. But looking into trying to do that is just totally impossible. There are countries in the world where that is totally a legitimate thing you can do quite easily, but in England, to get permission to live on any piece of land would take tens of thousands of pounds, if not more, months of back and forth, and also one of the things that you were talking about, how people were moving out of London. One of the things that I did, again, I moved out of London briefly before I eventually came out to Ukraine permanently. But for a while, I was living in Southend, again, just completely out of London. But before that, I was living in some warehouses in Tottenham, and this was kind of popular in parts of North London, Hackney, where there's this kind of live work thing where 10 people share a massive warehouse space, and they kind of all have various jobs inside it. And again, it was like the council was trying to abolish this way of living, even though it was housing plenty of people that were finding difficulty finding housing in the area. Lots of young people, professionals, don't have children, need somewhere to live in London, can only rent, and the rent is getting even more insane as time goes on. So let's go through those things in as much detail as you want, really. Let's have at it.
All right, well, let's start with the first one then, which is the planning system. So I think you kind of touched on it a bit there, and that people kind of think if you own some land, you have the right to build whatever. That's not really true at all, unfortunately. It probably was true, in the 19th century and before, where there was kind of a presumption that to the extent you had the right to the land, you had the right to build on it in whatever way you see fit. But that has been completely flipped, since for probably most of the past century, where a lot of laws were introduced in the first half of the 20th century, things like the Town and Country Planning Act, the Green Belt Acts, and those sorts of things, in which basically the presumption is that even if you do own some land, you have no right to do anything on it unless you get express permission from government first, and they're not going to make it very easy to give you that permission. So that's just I suppose a philosophical shift that has happened over the past century. But that wasn't necessarily a problem in the first half of the century. I mean, there was still quite a lot of building, including in London during the 30s and the 50s. I mean, the building I'm in right now is a 50s block of flats in relatively central London, that was built on a bomb site from the Blitz. Probably built very quickly, didn't need very much planning to do, all done in the space of a year or two. But in the last 30, 40 years, the number of other pieces of law with which builders and architects have to comply with has become really quite insanely long. And some of the examples you already touched on, there are things like environmental law, where you have to demonstrate that you can't, that you're not going to excessively damage any environment by the construction that you're doing. There are a lot of things like conservation areas in London, which add all sorts of other strictures, such that you can't build anything that doesn't look identical to whatever it's next door to. and lots of restrictions on height, which means that the average building in London, particularly in suburban London, is significantly shorter than that in similar sized city like Paris or Berlin, the places like that. Um, and add all of these things together, and it's no surprise that um, less building happens now, because there are so many more hoops you have to jump through just to get permission to do something, let alone to actually build it. And then the second part is the way the planning system works, and some of that is just the time involved. So yeah, I mentioned there it took 4 months just for the city to prove its own shed. But for a significant building, you can expect to wait a lot longer than that, in some cases years. And for a lot of the bigger projects, A, they don't get approved a lot, and B, big developers often find they have to come back a second or a third time um, before they come up with a design that everyone is happy with, by which point several years might have elapsed before they've actually got somewhere. Um, and I think there's also something to do with the incentives that local authorities have. I mean, they're not incentivized, or their sort of motivation is not to facilitate as much construction as possible. It is to come up with any conceivable reason why something can't be done, so that if anything goes wrong in the future, they're not at all liable for it. So it's a sort of extreme over caution. And also, a lot of planning officers are councillors, and a lot of people object to planning applications, which is no surprise. But basically, for any big development, the number of objections always outweighs the number of people who support it, which is just, I mean, it shouldn't really come as a surprise. It's just kind of human nature. I mean, people are more likely to complain about something than to write in saying they like it. If you wouldn't call up a call center and say, "Oh, I just want to let you know I had a really good experience yesterday," you wouldn't do that. So you'd only call in to complain, and it's the same with planning applications. A fun example I came across last year or the year before um, was a planning application by Diageo, which, for those who don't know, is a big London-listed spirits maker that owns things like Johnny Walker and a few other things. And they also own Guinness. And they wanted to, because Guinness is so popular right now, they wanted to build a micro brewery in central London to act as a sort of tourist destination, so that people could go there, have the Guinness experience, try some different craft versions of Guinness, etc. And even, I mean, that planning application took years to get over the line. Funny enough, they're actually building it in the site of an old 19th century brewery. And I think I forget the exact name, but I think it's on a road called Old Brewer's Yard or something like that. And even despite that, they had people objecting, saying it's out of character with the area. They're literally building a brewery in the site of an old brewery. And it took 2 or 3 different attempts before they ultimately got approval. And it was a several hours long planning session to get it over the line. I remember having attended that. That was 3 hours of my life I won't get back, but there we go. So that's another thing. What were the other things I mentioned? Oh, yeah, construction costs is obviously a huge thing. Energy costs have skyrocketed in the UK the past couple of years. Materials costs are higher. Post Brexit, a lot of European builders have gone home, bluntly. So there are just fewer people here now with the right skills, and it will take more time to train people up. And also, during COVID, a lot of construction firms, because of pandemic restrictions, etc., were ended up in quite dire straits financially. A lot of them have gone bust and continue to go bust the past couple of years. And because being in construction, particularly for the smaller companies, is such a risky business right now, it's very difficult to get anyone to lend to you. So I mean, I've spoken to insolvency specialists who say part of the problem is, you have a small construction firm that have a contract that fell through or something like that. They go to the banks, trying to get some finance for a few months just to tide them over, and the bank says, no, I'm sorry, you're too high risk, we can't we can't support you, and then they go under. So that's a phenomenon that's happening up and down the country at the moment that I've reported on. And then the last one is about, and this particularly applies to London, is about the space that we have and how we use it. So even though London geographically is this vast expanse, we don't use it very efficiently at all. And the two cases I've written about that are maybe some of the most egregious examples I'll come on to in a second. But I think it's partly about, I don't know, vested interests or historic contingencies and that sort of thing that this has happened. So and also, yes, you could change the planning system to make things easier, but that is something that will take years, if not decades, to properly bear fruit. And so what really needs to happen, I think, in London's case is, huge, big construction projects to really move the dial. And so, yeah, the two examples that I've written about, there's sort of one that would be quite expensive, but that isn't necessarily that controversial, and one that would be cheaper but more controversial. So the expensive one is one that I wrote about in today's CityAM paper, and that is that actually a surprising part of London, quite a big share of it, is used for train sheds, or effectively car parks for trains. So London has a huge train network. There are over 1,000 trains moving around the city at any one point, and at night they all have to go to bed somewhere. And at the moment, we just have these huge single-story train parks, if you like, that take up these huge spaces, and they're often in zone 2 or 3 or 4, so not that far out. And they're in these hugely valuable spaces that could be used much more productively. So, the example I gave in the piece this morning was the Neasden depot, which is in zone 3, so not that far from central London. It houses Metropolitan and Jubilee line trains at the moment, and it is 64 acres, which is bigger than St James's Park in central London. And that's just one example, but there are over a dozen.
I have actually, I have actually been inside the Neasden train depot. I fell asleep once on a train. I used to live up in northwest London. I fell asleep once on a train and woke up with the driver telling me I was inside the Neasden station. So I had a nice little walkout. It was fun, but yes, it was a vast amount. It was a giant shed full of trains. What can be done with them? The TfL will argue, well, where are we going to put these massive train sheds? It's not like we can build them multi-story train sheds.
Maybe you could. Who knows? But
not in Britain with our planning regulations. You can't.
Yeah, well, that's true. But yeah, they're huge space. I mean, can you imagine a property developer coming along and saying, I want to build a 64-acre car park because there's not enough car parking spaces in the borough? It would never happen. People be up in arms. They think it's insane. But that is the status quo for trains right now, is we just have single-story open air parking spaces, basically. But something can be done to make these areas much more productive. And the example I give in the piece is White City. So there used to be a 15 train wide depot in White City near the tube station. And in the early noughties, some developers came along and they wanted to build what is now Westfield Shopping Centre. And they ended up in a striking agreement with TfL, where they built an underground depot in the same place, made it slightly bigger, so it's now for 16 trains. And on top of that, they built the shopping mall. And that was a £1.6 billion project, of which 80 million, in other words, only 5%, was actually building the depot bit. So there was only 5% of the costs, but the return on investment on that land is absolutely huge. And to give you an idea of how big these sites are, how big the depot was, what is now on top of it, i.e. Westfield, is now Europe's biggest shopping centre. So just one of the vast number of train depots we have, that's just one example of something that was a complete waste of space, now a 1.6 billion shopping centre that's the biggest in Europe. So you could do a lot more of those if there's the political will. It wouldn't have to be a shopping centre, of course, it could be housing or whatever you want. Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, I'm from West London, Northwest London, mostly. So I've seen, White City. I've seen Wembley get redeveloped. I've seen the entirety of the place where I went to school, where Wembley High Road get developed over the years. So I've seen how, when there is a political will to do things, again, now it's out of the area that we're talking about, but Manchester, they're trying to redevelop Old Trafford, knock it down, rebuild Manchester United's stadium, and the thing that's been holding that back, at first it was they were going to redevelop just part of it, but over the years they needed that's a whole nother story. But again, Andy Burnham's trying to deal with the policy behind that. But there is a giant train station, and it's not a depot. I believe it's a something to do with freight. It's a freight transit station. But moving that freight transit station somewhere else where it's not, England is a vast green space of, there are parts of the country that there's just nothing on, that we could happily put a train station there. And rather than having all of this infrastructure built in, from a bygone era, shall we say, into our cities, which is stifling growth, stifling the ability for young people to buy housing. We're probably not far apart in age. So our generation and the generation below particularly are not able to buy housing, and they're moving further and further away from London. Some may argue, is that maybe that's a good thing. Maybe growing out of London it will help other parts of the country grow. Britain is quite lopsided in the fact that London is everything, and the rest of the country struggles to meet anywhere near the economic output that London does.
Yeah, no, that absolutely is a problem, and and I would definitely like to see that solved. And part of that is obviously more transport infrastructure spending of the kind we're talking about, things like HS2, HS3 in the future, etc. But that doesn't make the issue any less acute in London. And of course, the biggest problem we have as a nation is productivity. And the more expensive you make things to do, the worse productivity gets. So, whether it's London or anywhere else, you want to, in general, make things as cost effective as possible. And just quickly, the other example I gave a piece I did last year, which I think managed to offend quite a lot of people, partially successfully, is golf courses, and that
we are kindred spirits. I believe that's why I first followed you. I was like, this guy,
really? Okay.
This guy also hates golf courses. We need to destroy all of the golf courses, right? Talk to me about golf courses.
There's the odd crazy golf place I don't mind, but I think the main thing is it's not just how much space they take up. I think I worked out that if you add up all the golf courses in London, they actually account for twice the size of Hackney. In other words, you could add 2 extra boroughs to London without making it any bigger if you just redevelop these spaces. But also that actually quite a lot of them, I'm not sure if it's more or less than 50%, are actually council owned. They own these golf courses, but then they rent them out to private clubs for a peppercorn rent, where they don't actually make any money from it. And that is the arrangement they have. Meanwhile, they have, social housing waiting lists as long as you're on. So my proposal was, I was actually following one proposal by an architect, I think in Enfield, where they said, well, look, why don't we just take all of the 18-hole golf courses in London, cut them in half, so there's still a 9-hole course, and then the other half we can build blocks of flats with some nice gardens and a little nature reserve or something like that, and do that, and you could quite easily add 500,000 homes to London. That is how much space there is for things like golf courses.
If you're watching, if you're from the government, can you please destroy all of the golf courses? That would be high up on my domestic policy agenda. We need to declare war on golf courses. So look, the other thing that we haven't really touched upon, and it's the big, huge elephant in the English room, is NIMBYism. Again, this is not a problem that's unique to England, but when you've got parties who have a kind of outward policy agenda, like the Liberal Democrats, oh, we want to build on the green belt, blah 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 blah, and then you look at how they govern whenever they're in local councils, they are the nimbiest people in the country. The Greens, particularly NIMBY, Labour, Tory aren't. It's in every party. It's endemic. As soon as you become a local politician, your local interests are the thing that matters to you the most. And as you said, the people that complain are the people that are listened to, because they're the ones actually making a noise. Sometimes I get asked the question as a journalist from people who aren't really into following news or whatever. Why don't they publish positive news stories? One, because no one reads them. That's the first thing, and two, because positive things aren't really news. Your team winning a sports trophy, that's positive, that's news. But day functions as was supposed to is not an event that requires further insight to. When it comes to planning, when it comes to building things, the people that are driving opposition to these things have incredible power with the kinds of court cases they can launch. It's not just protesting and writing petitions, it's also filing frivolous, insane court cases that jam up production for years. So talk to me about Britain's mental NIMBY problem.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, it is a huge problem. But I'm going to shock you maybe slightly and say that in some respects, I think I'd come to the NIMBY's defense. And that's for the following reasons. One, I think, first of all, the planning system as is basically designed to encourage these kind of behaviors. So, if it's the case, as I said, we've moved philosophically from if you own this land, you have the right to do what you want in it, to if you own this land, you have to get permission to, put a brick down. Then what you're saying is culturally, it's everyone's moral duty to find problems with this application. So, if you ask anyone, a massive building is being built down the road, what do you think? They're going to look through the details and try and find problems with it, in the same way that if I were a journalist and my editor said, can you look into this company's operations? The first thing I'm going to do is try and find problems in it. I'm not going to come back and say, this company is great in every respect. And I think that's, so to an extent, I almost feel as though the NIMBYism kind of phenomenon has been one that has been set about by government, by the way that planning legislation has been designed, because it invites people to find problems with construction rather than encourages them to support stuff. I think the other thing is that NIMBYs, by virtue of the system, are much more powerful than they need be. I mean, politicians will very quickly capitulate if there is enough local opposition to something. And that, as a NIMBY, would make you feel empowered to do it more and more, I would suggest. If politicians said, well, no, I was elected on this platform, on the growth platform, whatever, so that's my principal objective, and I have to do that in whatever circumstances. That would at least, well, some of the kind of NIMBYist philosophy, but a lot of the time they basically say, if you complain about enough, I'll do something to stop it. And that's kind of the vibe by a lot of elected officials. And I think maybe one other element is, and this is a phenomenon that I suppose a lot of the kind of online discourse in British architecture touches on quite a lot, is that, to be blunt, this is maybe true more in in urban places like London, is there are frankly a lot of big planning applications that don't look that pretty. I mean, when you look at a lot of modern construction companies now, aesthetics is not what they set out to do. They often build stuff that they're trying to be unique architecturally, or there's some architect with a big ego behind it that wants to get some kind of design award, rather than build stuff that people actually think looks pleasant. Most people, if you ask them, just want to build stuff that looks kind of Victorian, and maybe that's because people are boring. But I think a lot of people, have a view about how good architecture looks, and it invariably does not cohere with what um, the biggest architects necessarily think. I mean, if you ask people about the Barbican, for example, they will say no, it's an eyesore. So again, to go back to what I said earlier, if you ask people to give their opinion on something, and given the kind of style that's become popular among architects, is a style that most people hate. Well, you have to be a rocket science to figure out what they're going to say.
Yeah, I have a love hate relationship with the way the Barbican looks, because I kind of really appreciate it, but at the same time I also think it's an eyesore. It's a really weird sort of But there's just if they tried to knock the Barbican down, there'd be a huge uproar from people
Yeah,
that
yeah.
because it's our eyesore basically. But it's a fascinating one. It is a really interesting building. It's not just an ugly piece of concrete, as sometimes it's described. But look, I agree with you, and I also think that we should build large Victorian style, facades on our buildings. I think that'd be lovely. If we need to build up, like most cities in the world with huge, dense populations have large buildings. We if we build, no, I'm not saying build huge tower blocks everywhere like we did in the 70s, but build 4 or 5 story housing in parts of the country where we could knock down some golf courses. It would be a really good idea. But again, I'm probably going to shock you here, because this is something I agree with Tom Harwood on, and this is not something, and Tom Harwood's not someone I agree with on many things at all. But I really think we should have built the giant sphere of death. I was really outraged that they blocked the building of the giant sphere, because look, it's a stupid giant sphere, but why shouldn't we have a stupid giant sphere? The arguments that it will, stink up our skyline, I don't agree. I think it would add, people said that about the Millennium Dome, and everyone loves the look of it now. No one
Yeah.
complains. Again, it needs renovating itself. Really, it fell apart in the last storm, right? So, but again, talk to me about these experimental things that we used to do in London, that we now again are just not even interested in countries spending huge amounts of money here to build ridiculous things anymore. We used to be a country that built stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, the that thing in Stratford, what do you say it was called? The sphere.
The giant
It's quite a
sphere
good.
of death.
That's the one. Yeah. That's kind of a case in point, because that would have been a great large scale music venue. And the irony is, the people who are opposing it will now be frustrated that there'll be more concerts in things like parks, because there aren't enough big music venues to host them in. So it's kind of there's a certain irony to that.
I want to
Um,
understand how ABBA managed to build an entire venue for themselves in the middle of London. I mean, obviously they did it in a part that was near the river, right? So, but again, they've managed. It can be done, but it's the most expensive concert hall ever built, the ABBA one, right? So that it's probably so much of it was spent in planning rather than the building itself, right?
yeah, well, exactly, yeah. But I mean, the Barbican, that was a project by the City of London Corporation in the sort of mid 20th century. That was a hugely ambitious project. I mean, it's a vast piece of land. Um, the designs were controversial, to say the least, but they weren't. I don't think they were counting the number of objections in that particular instance. But they wanted to be bold. They wanted to demonstrate, something kind of futuristic and forward-looking. Whether or not they succeeded is a separate question. But yeah, that's a very good example. Um, yeah, I think. Well, of course, the other good example is building transport infrastructure, where obviously we built the first fully fledged underground tube line, and several after that. But you look at the difficulties with HS2, a large part of which is the fact that people are objecting to having a train line near their farm or something like that. As a result of which, there's some parts of the line that actually go underneath nothing. Basically, they've built tunnels purely because people didn't want to see the train in the area, and so that is part of the reason, aside from political dithering, that the cost of something like that have ballooned so much over the past decade.
Where is all that money going? It's going surely to government departments that are complaining that they are low on money. So I try to understand why we're spending all of this. So surely these are filling the coffers of these councils that must be able to spend it on all kinds of things, which they are clearly unable to do. So where is all this money going? It seems like a bottomless pit of consultants and surveyors and
Yeah.
what's going on with that?
Yeah, well, there's a large part of that. Of course, as I said, part of it is the fact they are building tunnels rather than just normal rail lines, and that's a hugely, adds hugely to the value. Also, there's all of the conservation concerns, and there's the popularly discussed bat tunnel, which costs like £100 million because there were concerns that some bats might be disturbed by the construction of the rail line, which is not something you'd imagine in Victorian England when all of these lines were being built first time round. But yeah, it's very alarming. And of course, I mean, the other thing is from the sort of local authority perspective is that they set quite strict criteria that they have, including things like affordable housing, which is not a sort of strict definition of affordability, but rather it's just a percentage discount on market values. Where again, particularly, obviously a well-intentioned rule that in these cases, but it often has unforeseen consequences. I think there was a case in Peckham a couple of weeks ago where a housing developer, property developer, came up with a proposal to redevelop an old abandoned or sort of dilapidated shopping centre and turn it into a place for 800 new homes, of which I think 100 would be affordable. And the local authority said, sorry, but the percentage isn't high enough, so we're rejecting the plan because they wanted it to be, I think, 30%. The irony of that is, if that property company had come back the next day and said, okay, we'll only build 100 homes in this area, but 30 of them will be affordable, they would have said, yeah, okay, that's fine. But their proposal for 100 homes would have been rejected. And meanwhile, this council has a wait list for social housing, that's longer than you can imagine.
One of the other things that is left out in this argument, and again, this is one I agree, we need more social and affordable housing. I 100% agree with that. But the thing that people don't understand is that we also need the higher rent housing, lots of it, because if you don't have that housing, then the people who can afford it will buy whatever housing they can afford, which means that there's less for everyone else. It's not like we have, there are parts of the world where they have these huge housing projects that are completely empty and abandoned and no one's in them. This is not a problem in London, right? Properties that are on the market are taken off the market pretty quickly. We have a shortage of housing for everyone, from the top right down to because we are a huge city bursting full of people, but without building the sufficient infrastructure for those people. So look, let's say that you are made Prime Minister tomorrow. What are some of the things that you would advise the government to do to try and get rid of some of this red tape that's getting in the way and to try and get Britain building? I know this is something the government talks about a lot, and they will argue that they have made progress in several areas. So, but you are talking about something that's very difficult. Again, Sadiq Khan, someone I voted for a bunch of times, and someone I would probably vote for the next time as well, is someone who has blocked several building proposals that I think that should have been built. So, it's talk to me about how we can get out of this mess through policy.
Yeah, well, just to come back to what I was saying earlier, first of all, on terms of the definitions of affordability, part of the problem there is that the more applications that are rejected, the worse the definition becomes, because it's a discount below market rates. So if, say, the average flat costs 100 and the definition of affordable is 80, but then all of these proposals get rejected, well, then supply isn't moving anywhere, demand's going up. So now by the time they do but by the time they do accept a proposal, now the cost of a flat is 100, and the definition of 120, and the definition of affordable is now 100. So what was market rate is now the definition of affordable. So it's just they're inflicting damage on their own constituents that they wanted to grant affordable housing to. But what would I do if I were Prime Minister? Well, I mean, there are certainly there are things I think sound good that the current government are doing, of which one I was particularly interested in was their ability to veto decisions or overturn decisions by local authorities. They've not. I mean, that was a sort of Angela Rayner proposal. It's not been used very often so far as I can tell. But if they got serious about that, if they said, look, any major house building project, if the local authority rejects it, we are 100% of the time going to approve it, then that would spark huge behavioural changes by local authorities. And I think they might realise, actually, we've got to get serious about this now. We can't just automatically reject stuff just because a few people are up in arms. So that's quite a big thing if they get serious about it. The second thing, I think, is also the housing sort of infrastructure side, by which I mean the power networks, water networks, all of that kind of stuff. That is a huge constraint on building construction at the moment. So there are big projects that have been either thwarted or that haven't got permission because there just isn't enough power available locally to build a new town, or there aren't the sort of water connections and that sort of thing. So speeding up the stuff that's sort of outside the planning system, that will be a huge part of driving up house building. You could also do things that Sadiq Khan has again talked about, not done very much about yet, which is relaxing the definitions of green belt, so that if there's an area, I mean, the classic example they give is like an abandoned petrol station or something that is technically in a green belt, but that is by no definition green. That should be something that you should instantly be able to build on without any questions asked, I think. And then I think there are other things about, as I say, I would maybe relax the definition of affordability, so maybe it's a number of homes rather than a percentage. Relax the definition, so it's not necessarily about market, a share of market value. And also the government, not much social housing has been built as well, and that's an issue. I mean, and the more you can add to housing supply, whether it's in the private or the public market, the better it will be for prices. I think a lot of the problems that we've had, in terms of government approaches to house building, is that they always think of it from the sort of demand side. So they say things like, oh, we're going to make it slightly easier for someone to get a mortgage, or we're going to soften the conditions for this or that. But fundamentally, if the home you want to buy is 10 times your salary, it doesn't matter how much you relax the mortgage conditions, you're never going to be able to afford it. So there's too much focus on that sort of stuff a lot of the time.
So look, thanks to everyone who's following along tonight. If you're listening along on YouTube, please do like and subscribe. Really, I do appreciate all of you following. More of you are watching on YouTube than are watching along generally live on Twitch, at least. If you want to talk to us, if you're following along on Twitter, the only way to interact with us directly is through the Twitch chat. And thanks to everyone who's joining us on Twitch. I will just say we are coming to the last part of the show. So if you've got any questions for Simon, now's the time to stick them in that Twitch chat. I did want to just kind of ask another question to you, Simon, about the Greenbelt. You mentioned it there in your last answer. It's something particularly what appealed to me about the Liberal Democrats many years ago, but they didn't really seem to enact this when they were in the coalition government. I'm showing my age here, but talking about building on the green belt, and it was something that didn't come to fruition. And again, that cursed quote of Nick Clegg dismissing building nuclear power because it wouldn't be online until 2024, I believe it was. Maybe it was 2026, but whatever. Like, those are nuclear power stations we could have online running by now, building, helping reduce electricity costs, help keep our, industry. The cost of electricity is so linked with growth, because electricity fuels industry, right? So, one of the issues that my local community had is the fish and chip shops started closing down after the war in Ukraine, because they could no longer afford to keep the fryer, the huge amounts of money they were spending on fryers. And I'm like, that's something that's never even crossed my mind. But the fish and chip shop that we had, a local family, Iraqi family, had run this fish and chip shop for decades, and it closed down because they could no longer afford the cost. And it wasn't because people were no longer buying fish and chips. So, talk to me about the green belt. Talk to me about this infrastructure problem that we have. It's not just building houses. We also need power. We need power lines. We need water. We need sewage, infrastructure. How can we address these needs with the space that we currently have available to us?
Well, the funny thing about the green belt is, as a sort of concept philosophically, it's quite a novel invention. I mean, it only kind of entered common parlance in like the 1920s and 30s. It wasn't really a concept that ever existed in Britain up until then. And the reason it happened at the time, funny enough, was because actually the rate of house building was so rapid at the time that there were concerns among politicians that it was getting out of control. People are building so many houses that we need to stop this. I mean, what a problem to have. That's, I quite envy the politicians of that era. Whereas, of course, we now have the complete opposite problem, and the green belt is the worst possible thing to stand in the way of it. But what's interesting is you can also track just how much of an effect the greenbelt laws had. You can see, I mean, if you go out to parts of North London, for example, you can see rail tracks that just stop in the middle of nowhere, like train viaducts that just suddenly stop and there's nothing beyond them. And that is because these rail companies were planning on building new towns and villages on the outskirts of London. And the moment the Greenbelt legislation passed, they just stopped in the middle of their tracks and up sticks and went home. And those sort of buildings, those sort of bits of train infrastructure are still there. Not a single train's ever run on them. So loads of things like that, and you can just see, you can already imagine a parallel universe in which that didn't happen, and London was a much bigger place. But yeah, it's quite a novel concept. It's not one that has to exist. It didn't exist for centuries in Britain. It isn't one that has to exist for centuries more. That's probably what I'd say in a nutshell.
Well, look, I mean, I love London. I always thought London was a huge city because in England, it is a huge city. But when you've been to like a truly huge city, you kind of look at London and go, well, hang on. There's so many things we could be doing better with regards to, like, the tube isn't as bad as it gets a rap for. The tube is probably one of our stronger points, even if it does have its problems. But there is so much more we could do to build outwards. So look, where can people find your work if they want to follow along with the kind of reporting that you've been doing on Britain's building woes, I guess?
Well, you can if you work in the Square Mile, or if you commute in, you'll probably find our paper outside a tube station near you. Also our website, cityam.com, and I'm also starting a Substack later this week
Okay.
with CityAM, which will look at some of these kinds of issues as well as other things that pique my interest.
Well, listen, that sounds fantastic. We will definitely put a link to that Substack. If you send us the link, we'll
Great.
put it in the show notes for you. Look, one final question, I guess, because we haven't had any audience questions, which I don't blame the audience. Normally they do ask a question or two, but my audience is generally kind of a foreign policy audience. So I'm trying to force like British issues onto them by hook or by crook, but we're getting there. And we've had over 1,000 listeners tonight, so there are definitely people that are interested in this topic. You must have seen some good news stories over the past, let's say, 18 months or so. Is there anything being built in London that we should be able to look forward to? Is there something coming down the pipeline, maybe 2028, maybe 2030, that might start to alleviate some of these problems that we've been having?
Well, I mean, yeah, good news always seems to be in short supply. But I mean, I will say, as much as I have castigated the City of London Corporation tonight, they are actually one of the few places that build lots or give permission for the construction of lots of big buildings, and there are actually loads of 40-plus story buildings that are set to come online in the square mile over the next five years or so. So it actually, if you look at, if you take a picture of the square mile today and in 5 years' time, you'll see actually really a lot of big development, and it's also more diverse development. I mean, the square mile used to just be basically a series of office blocks a few years back. Now, actually, a lot of these towers that are being built are things like hotels, entertainment places. So it's becoming a much more vibrant part of town. And so I think if other local authorities can certainly take a lesson or two for how they're encouraging that kind of construction. In terms of other good news stories, I mean, actually in London in particular, house building is getting really bad. I mean, we had a story last month that only 900 homes were built in the second quarter or completed in the second quarter, which is like really shocking. But I mean, that's based just one development, one big development. That's kind of all it is. So that's, I mean, there aren't any good news stories on that side, I'm afraid to say. But actually, I mean, one thing I'm quite excited about is East-West Rail, if that happens, and that does seem to be actually making genuine progress. A new section of it is going to open in the next few months. There are lots of sort of satellite towns opening around Oxford and Cambridge, things like Bicester Town, Bicester Village, and things like that. And that actually looks like that sort of east-west arc that the government has talked about, that genuinely is taking shape. I mean, there are you go there and there's lots of stuff being built. There are property companies advertising whole new villages that you can buy a house in. And so that is our biggest hope right now. I think that something like that is successful.
Fantastic. So you heard it here first. If you want to get in on the early movement, move to Bicester, right? Bicester Village. That's the place to be, right? Okay, great. I'm going to start looking up properties in Bicester. I mean, I can't afford a property in Ukraine, let alone afford a property in Bicester. But listen, Simon, thanks so much for joining us on the Oz Katerji Show. Really, really appreciate the insights. Would love to have you back on the show to talk about another exciting, frustrating story from the world of British development. So thanks so much for joining us. And I'll put a link to all of your Substack in the show if you just send it to me afterwards. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All the best. So, obviously, a lot of news this week around Ukraine. I am trying not to be too reactive to it because, I mean, I expect this whole thing is just going to be, I don't think there's going to be any difference in what's put forward by the Russians, and I think the Americans are going to bend over backwards to try and accommodate Putin. But it's not going to be something that's agreeable to the Ukrainians. Therefore, nothing's going to happen. So that's kind of what I'm expecting. I might be wrong. They might come to some kind of deal that they force on the Ukrainians, and I can't even understand how that would happen and how a Ukrainian government would navigate that, but I could be wrong. So, it's much easier when you're just tweeting and you don't have these clips of yourself saying these things on here. But I'm putting that out there in advance about how I feel, how these kind of negotiations are going to go. And you've seen streamers say horrible, terrible things on Ukraine, which they don't apologize for. So if I am wrong about this, I will apologize for it. I definitely want to audit myself on this. But I think that the situation will just continue. I don't think there's going to be any kind of resolution coming on Friday. I think this whole thing is really particularly a humiliation for the United States. I think it's just embarrassing as a country. This isn't diplomacy. This is Putin trying to pull one over on the rest of the world, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians aren't going to go along with any deal that abandons Ukraine's security to Russian interests. So that's why I don't think there's going to be any resolution. That's why I'm not booking a show this week to talk about it and go blah 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 blah. I'm going to just deal with that next week. We'll bring on a guest to try and deal with that, because I don't think we're in a position where we're going to be talking about the end to the war, at the end of this week. So that's how I feel about it. There is obviously some other, Ukraine news that we can talk into. It's a particularly difficult period for parts of the east of the country. It's not like, things are going fantastically here at the moment. So the Ukrainians are under a lot of pressure. There should be no mistaking that, but I don't feel like there's going to be any kind of resolution coming this weekend. If anyone was expecting one, which I doubt, knowing my audience, you would be. Reading some of the questions here. I'm still wondering how you can make a deal without the country in question being involved. You're right, a random shot in the dark, it's total nonsense. Noel saying, perhaps more importantly, how are you feeling for the start of the season? I am looking forward to it. I am a Carlos Baleba and a Gianluigi Donnarumma signing away from getting ahead of myself this season. I will say I am actually wearing a football kit, wearing Syria's new football kit. Got it on today. But I am excited for the football season. Maybe we'll do a football episode. I don't know how many. Again, I forced like British politics onto people, so maybe I'll do like goth music and football as well. Just really broaden it out. Who knows? There's no rules here. I'm just kind of interviewing people that I think I'd have an interesting conversation with. So I'm really having fun so far. I hope you guys are tuning in week in, week out to hear people talk about just totally random stuff. We've got Paul Conroy tomorrow, so he is incredible, legendary war photographer, very famous. If you haven't heard of him, Google him, watch his documentary Under the Wire, watch A Private War, the film that was made in part about his life and the life of Marie Colvin. But he's a dear friend of mine, so he's going to be coming round tomorrow. We'll probably have him in studio. I haven't checked with him. Maybe he'll do it from his flat, but maybe he'll come here. So, but that'll be an interesting episode. So look forward to that. Big thanks to Simon Hunt for joining us and talking us through a topic that I know isn't very thrilling to foreign audiences, but it's something that I want to bring up, because if Britain is heading for some kind of political crisis point in which we elect a far-right politician, which judging by the polls, it is something that looks like a frightening reality. And there is no world in which a coalition of the Green Party and Jeremy Corbyn are ever elected into government. That's never going to happen. But left populists and right populists on either side are definitely seizing the moment. It's the right populists who are going to win if there's going to be any kind of major political upheaval in this country. But if that happens, it won't be because of, many of the reasons people give about, it'll be because Labour were fundamentally unable to build the country, rebuild the country, and to make it grow. Economic growth, people need to feel better off. People need to feel that public services are improving. And if those things don't happen, then Labour will rightly lose the will of the people. The electorate won't vote for them again. I am very, very frustrated by seeing parties that really don't have any interest in policy or governance. What they're interested in is making enemies, pointing at the people that are enemies and pointing at the people that are the oppressed, and those kinds of narratives really tear the country apart and don't bring any. We've been talking about planning regulations and the kind of competing interests of local communities, and this stuff is complicated. There are no like super easy solutions where it's just do all of this and everything goes right. Any populist government that comes in is going to have to deal with the same problems. And one of the things that we've seen in Europe when these right-wing populists have been elected is they've governed as conservatives because that's who they are by and large. They are conservatives who have hard right views on immigration and so on, but they don't have the solutions. They haven't had the solutions to fix all of the problems of these countries, not just in Europe. We've had other populists taking over and not managing to find the economic solutions that were so supposedly just waiting across the around the corner. All you have to do is chuck the immigrants out. I'm not in England anymore, and I'm trying to like stay abreast of developments there. I am frustrated by the political scenario unfolding before us. I'm frustrated at the party that I voted for too. It's not that I'm blaming everyone else for the problems that the government currently has. And that's not just domestically. Obviously, I've talked about the foreign policy stuff at length. But yeah, if there is this thing happening in the future and people are going to be like, what's this government's view on Russia and so on, it's going to be because of these domestic issues that I'm trying to talk about. So I hope that some of that can be, just kind of understood. There is a reason for talking about these things that might not be as flashy as some of the other topics I talk about. Yes, you have missed most of the show, Liquid Amber. I'm sorry. You think you're interested in urban planning because of how many countries are experiencing a housing crisis? Yeah, Kabush, that's correct. This isn't just a uniquely British problem, but it is a problem that we're experiencing in parts of what you'd call traditionally the Western world, right? We have situations in which the cities are lopsided. There are parts of the country where housing is cheap and people don't want to live. You can buy a house in Middlesbrough for 20 grand. Maybe you can't anymore, but I saw some run-down, dilapidated terraces that were going pretty cheap in parts of the northeast of the country. Not lots of people want to live in the run-down parts of northeast England. I don't blame them. Again, I'm never going to be a politician running in northeast England. Ian Dale, bless his heart, when that thing he said about this constituency he wanted to run in I could just say, the northeast is grim and not have to worry about, ever trying to require the people of the northeast to elect me in any kind of capacity. But people don't want to live there, so that's a problem. We need to build the houses where people actually want to live. Well, look, RGB, RVB, Liquid Amber, the episodes are online. You'll be able to watch the whole show on YouTube. If you're not liking and subscribing yet, please do like and subscribe, particularly those of you who are like in the chat every week. If you're not liking the YouTube page yet, I'm truly failing. We are growing slowly. We burst past 600 followers, so hopefully 700 in the next week or so. That'd be great. I'm enjoying, giving these shows to you. The numbers are not the reason why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I'm having fun with all of this. But I do hope that the show does grow and we get a larger audience and we can hopefully get some bigger guests. I'm trying to book who I can. But it's a lot of work chasing people up, trying to get them all available at this time of the evening. It's not very appealing to Americans either, time-wise. So getting American guests is tougher. But I have put in for some interesting kind of wild card guests who are tentatively saying potentially, but not at the moment. So you might see some interesting officials from countries that you wouldn't expect me to be having contacts with. We'll see if they can be convinced to come on. But it will be an interesting discussion nevertheless. So thanks for everyone for tuning in tonight. Tomorrow, Paul Conroy back to the more usual foreign correspondent stuff, talking about Libya, Syria, talking about Paul's work in Ukraine. It's going to be a fun episode, so please do tune in. And on Thursday, we're going to be talking to my dear pal Dimitri. We're going to be talking about trade, tariffs, Donald Trump, what he's doing to the world economy. If you don't understand the whole tariff, we've got a trade expert who's going to come in and explain to us how this whole tariff situation is working, the pressures it's putting on Europe and so on. And, again, a lot of this stuff goes over my head too. So I'm going to be learning alongside all of you guys. So, it'd be really... Do I know Hassan Piker? He'd love to see you two have a chat. Okay, so listen, I do know Hassan. I don't know him personally, but Hassan and I have had a disagreement over what is widely called the Highway of Death in Iraq. Hassan said some stuff about Ukraine, which I find really, 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 really bad. But would I happily talk to Hassan? Yes, I would happily talk to Hassan about these things and explain to him why I disagree with him on the Highway of Death and Ukraine. But look, I can't imagine a world in which Hassan pays any more attention to me, particularly after I told him what did I say to him? It wasn't very nice. I called him a bootlicker. I think I called him a bootlicker. I don't think he's going to want to talk to me after I called him a bootlicker. But if you do, Hassan, and you want to have a debate or whatever, I will call you out for all of that Ukraine nonsense and the stuff you said about Iraq and Syria. We can go into that, but I doubt he hasn't got the stones, man, to argue with someone who actually knows. These people who do these streaming things don't generally have backgrounds in anything. It's like Joe Rogan. It's a comedian. It's just like a guy who doesn't really. It just sits there like amazed by everything that he hears. I have spent my entire adult life, working as a correspondent, as a reporter, working, doing humanitarian stuff. This is my field. I know it in and out, right? Mostly in the Middle East. But this stuff, this geopolitics stuff, it's not something I dabble in. It's not something I read a lot about. It's something that I am, qualified to talk about in my own right. So I can't imagine that I would ever interact with people who don't do that. I don't think it would end very well for them, personally speaking. But I'm not a very polite person in my debates. So, but yeah, look, I don't want to spend any more time talking Hassan Piker. I didn't bring him up, right? It's not like I started talking about Hassan. The audience were like talking about. I can understand he is the big political streamer on this website, right? So I can understand that the comparisons between us might be made, even though he's a huge account and I am someone who has just started. So I mean, look, fair enough. If you're watching, if you talk to him, send him this clip. Tell him I will happily. I'm not going to rescind the bootlicker comment, but I will tell him why he's wrong about the highway of death, why it wasn't a war crime, because it wasn't a war crime. Okay, and I can go into the many reasons why, and we can talk about international law properly, which is something I understand and you clearly don't, if you want, but I don't. I don't think you want that smoke, dude. I don't think you want to go into the details of why, because it didn't work out well for you on Twitter when we did talk about that. So, yeah. But whatever. If you're watching, dude, wagwan, innit? All right. Well, that was an interesting end to the show. Thanks for posing the question. I followed this. What's it called? Twitch Rivals. They do these weird kind of. I will happily Twitch Rivals like anyone you want me to Twitch Rivals. Like I will, whatever. Get us, doing, ping pong. I don't know. Find something that we can do. I'm interested in this whole Twitch thing. I want to see where it goes. It's certainly a blast, but. No, look, I'm not looking to boost my viewers with Hassan's viewers. I don't think we have too many crossover viewers. I'll be honest with you, but I would look. I will. There are people I wouldn't debate. Like I'm straight up not going to debate like a Nazi or whoever. But I will debate some of these guys who are not tankies, but are like tanky adjacent in their views. I will happily school these clowns. Who knows? Maybe I'll invite Michael Tracy on. That'd be fun. I still have Vauch's episode where he invited Michael Tracy on, and he just spent the whole time going, Michael. Like it's hilarious. So yeah, I would maybe consider the Butter Goblin. The other funny thing, the streamer thing that I've seen is the Norman Finkelstein debate with Destiny, and he just got his name wrong like every time. He was like Mr. Bonelli, Mr. Bonori, Mr. Bonelli, like just over and over again, just getting his name wrong. And look, I'm not a fan of Norman Finkelstein. I think the man is preposterously wrong on many things that he said in the past and in the present. But watching him rip into Destiny was absolutely hilarious. So I would happily have a similar debate with Destiny. But again, I would probably be very tempted to call him Mr. Bonelli over and over again in that Norman Finkelstein voice. Anyway, look, I've spent about 15 minutes talking about other streamers, and I'm getting sucked in to this world of talking about other streamers, and it's not I wanted to offer something different of like interviewing interesting people. I was trying to do the kind of Dua Lipa kind of way into interviewing people. That's fun. It's people don't have to worry about any of my own personal drama or opinions or bullshit, because I'm mainly talking to other people about the interesting things they have to say. But you see the chat, they're like the little devil on my shoulder, like, get into fights with streamers, you should get into fights with streamers. And I'm like, okay, I'm trying to. I tried to like pull myself out of the Twitter wars, and to some extent, I have, withdrawn my forces from the battlefield of Twitter, much to the disappointment of many of my former followers who seem to think I've gone soft in my old age or stopped caring about the topics that I passionately spent years telling people I care about. I'm tired, man. I'm an old man. Like, I'm not in my mid-20s anymore. I am still as angry as I am, but it's more kind of cantankerous now rather than kind of like a throbbing rage in my head at the state of the world. You can't be that angry all the time. It's just it'll defeat you. You have to accept the world's limitations and the things that you can do in that world. I realized it was easier to be more influential with the kind of causes that I care about if I'm, more blasé about how I feel about things. It's definitely won me more audiences than the again, and I shout out to the people who know me as the guy who they followed because he was calling people dickheads on Twitter or whatever. Like, I'm still that person, but I just don't want to invest my energy in it. Like, it's tiring to do that all the time. And there is more important work that I can do and am doing and trying to bring to you guys with more regularity. I'm in Ukraine. We've got a war going on here. We've got much more stories to cover here, and getting into beef is not necessarily conducive to achieving the goals that I would like to achieve with the work that I'm doing, which is to try and keep people informed as best I can. But thank you guys for supporting me nevertheless. I appreciate that. And I will look, the invitation is open, particularly to people with bigger followers than me. I will explain to people. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Noel. That's particularly why. Look, it's open. If there are other streamers that are interested in talking to me or debating with me in particular, I would love to have a more kind of combative, hostile episode or two. That'd be fun. I am interested in that. It's just about figuring out when we can do it and around what topic and what parameters. That would be fun. But look, thank you so much for following along, everyone. Really appreciate all of my regular viewers tuning in. I really appreciate the 1,000 or more of you on Twitter that are tuning in as well. If you want to talk to me, like what you've seen, all of the little devils in my shoulders. I'm going to call you guys the little devils now. You're my little devils. If you want to join the little devils on my shoulder, you have to talk in the Twitch chat. And you please, if you're just watching along on Twitch, make an account. Sign up, follow me on Twitch because I've already got a handful of followers on there, and it really helps to try and grow the channel. So again, I know there are a bunch of you who just kind of don't even have an account and stuff. Please do follow. It helps us grow. And yeah, maybe we will end up doing some more, argy-bargy, pugilistic conversations with American streamers. Yeah, join us. Google gabble. One of us. Yeah. But look, I appreciate people who've been donating to my Ko-fi. I appreciate people who are liking and subscribing. I appreciate the comments. I'm reading all of the comments that you post on YouTube and stuff. I might ignore Twitter comments that are sent to me, but I definitely read your YouTube ones. So if you're watching thinking, how can I, send a message to me, write something in the YouTube comments. I'll definitely read that. There aren't many of you, so I can't pretend that I'm being drowned by comments like I can on Twitter, because I am being drowned by comments. So I generally ignore half of them anyway. But look, thanks so much for following. I am just rabbiting away at you guys, which is, I suppose, what people do on these things. Somehow 1,600 people of you are watching this at the point. More people were interested in me kind of rabbiting than us talking about the shed and the planning permission stuff. That was the important stuff. it was the planning permission stuff that I threw the show about today. Thanks. Anyway, listen, thanks to everyone in the audience. Appreciate you. Have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow night for the Paul Conroy show. It's been a pleasure as always. So yeah, have a good one. Bye.